As colleagues, we'll get started now. As colleagues join in, we can also invite them to identify themselves in the chat box via message. But I wanted to thank everyone for joining for this event that CVIIC is co-sponsoring with Migration Policy Institute. And on behalf of CVIIC, I'm Jesus Martinez, the Executive Director. I'd like to thank you for joining and also to thank our guest for today, Ariel Ruiz, for Migration Policy Institute. Before I get to talk about Ariel in a second, I just want to highlight the importance, from my perspective, of the work that Migration Policy Institute has been doing over the years, both in analyzing migration trends and policies in the US, but also for doing it at the international level. From my perspective, Migration Policy Institute is the nation's leading migration research center and always producing very high quality studies, has databases that one can consult. Very important source of information for those of us who work with immigrant families who are involved in some way or another, also in analyzing migration policies. So that is a very important organization that I would highly recommend that you consult on an ongoing basis, subscribe to their newsletters as well, so you can find out what they're doing and publishing on an ongoing basis. With respect to Ariel, he has been very kind in accepting our invitation to do a presentation based on research that Migration Policy Institute and he in particular carried out recently, analyzing US immigration enforcement trends and the shifts that are being identified in the current period. Ariel, I'm an old guy, so I say that everyone is young compared to me. So Ariel is a young but very experienced researcher producing some very high quality studies and reports from MPI. He's a senior policy analyst at MPI, where he works with the U.S. Immigration Policy Program and the Latin America and Caribbean Initiative. So I'm also, if I'm not mistaken, Ariel, you're also from Michoacan? So one more Michoacano add to your list of Michoacano contacts. And we don't do it on purpose. We don't only invite Michoacanos to present, but Ariel is a very outstanding researcher, and I'm very pleased that he was able to allocate a little bit of time to chat with us today. So without further ado, Ariel, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to do this presentation with our colleagues here in the Central Valley, and in some cases, some colleagues also from other parts of California.
That's good, Jesus. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. I think this is especially important and unique experience for me because I'm based in Sacramento, California, though the Migration Policy Institute is actually based in Washington, D.C., where I lived for many years. I actually call California home. So I hope that this conversation is the beginning of more that we can have to try to understand what's happening in our local context, but also what could be ahead that we should be asking for researchers like myself and others at MPI to understand what's changing in terms of immigration policy, not just enforcement, but in general. To try to capture and to give ourselves enough time for questions and answers, which I oftentimes find the most important parts of the conversation, I will try to keep my remarks shorter so that we can have more of that time allocated to hear from you. What I'll discuss in my presentation is going to include some of the more recent trends, but also the policies that we've understand the Trump administration to be conducting in terms of immigration enforcement, how they have changed or where we think they're changing, the effects that they can have in the undocumented immigrant population in the country, look specifically at where we can with data on California. I'll talk a little about the tools that we have online that Jesus referenced on our website, and then understand specifically when we talk of enforcement, how it affects arrests and deportations and detentions of immigrants in the country, and potentially looking forward to what other countries, but what other organizations outside of research fields can do to respond to the current phenomena we're having. So the first point that I think we need to get into and right away is that we live in a new era of enforcement in the United States. There's things that are continuous from previous administrations. In fact, there's some similarities between the Biden administration and the previous Trump administration. But under his second term, President Trump has put into place significantly different guidelines that affect how enforcement is conducted. At MPI, we believe that in many regards, this is unprecedented use of immigration authority. Some of it is within the US law, some of it is interpretations that the administration is taking together. But overall, it's leading us into a very new space with different consequences for the population of immigrants, not just undocumented immigrants, but immigrants across the board in the United States. The key components of this new era of enforcement include a new whole of government approach. We are now seeing that in addition to ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and the CUP, Custom Borders Protection, now federal agencies like the FBI, the DEA, the Bureau of Federal Prisons, and even the IRS are now tasked with helping identify people who may be undocumented in the United States and potentially collaborate then to share data and information that would lead and benefit the administration's operations on immigration across the country. This is significantly important because it requires, on one end, a lot of coordination, but second, it also diverts resources from these other organizations that have dedicated missions for other important aspects of their work and now are working on immigration issues. And it extends across the country. The second sort of series of small strategies that have added up to new enforcement have been increased operations in the interior. In part, this is because we've seen lower numbers of immigrants arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border, as you may know, for now about almost 2 years, including the end of the Biden administration. Asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border has almost dissolved completely. And in some cases, that has meant that the administration currently has been able to divert some of the Border Patrol and other resources that it had at the border to now work in the interior. This means that we've seen more operations. We've also seen an increase in building capacity for bed detention space, and that's been a key component that we'll get into here in a minute. We've seen also smaller, but what may be seen as technical but important resulting consequence guidelines for expedited removal processing. That is usually migrants who have entered the country and who have been in the United States for less than 2 years are found to be subject to deportation and are deported under more quickly circumstances and with less access to different processes and rights that more migrants can have. We've seen that be expanded, not just in terms of geography, but also in different cases, or even people, for example, are seeking to marry or become U.S. citizens or naturalized citizens after marrying a U.S. citizen spouse. We've also seen new agreements to deport migrants who are from third countries to a different one. For example, Mexico currently accepts nationals of 7 different nationalities to Mexico. This started, by the way, under President Biden, but it's continued under President Trump. And there are now, the latest count that I have, has been around 18 agreements across the world that the United States has to remove or deport migrants from third countries to these other places. Most recently, the attention has been focused in African countries like Ghana or in other places in Asia like Uzbekistan. But I repeat, the largest numbers are going toward Mexico. In addition to that, we've seen the administration rescind prior guidance that restricted operations of immigration enforcement in sensitive locations. Those locations were churches, hospitals, schools, and in some cases, courts, immigration courts as well. We're now beginning to see those to be undone. In California specifically, I haven't been made aware of cases yet that where ICE has gone actually on school grounds. Usually what happens is that ICE or other immigration officials are on the street or nearby schools or churches or hospitals, but haven't yet been in specifically these locations. You may have other evidence, or you may have heard different changes in your particular region, but that's one aspect that we're beginning to continue to track. And what this means is that it makes and rises in additional fear for the community of immigrants who's here without legal status. I cannot understate or overstate enough how the role of design and implementation of new technology has taken a very significant approach in the way that we understand migration enforcement. There's now cameras, more technology at the border and in the interior that is meant to try to identify more quickly migrants who may be here without status, but also to try to leverage different collaboration with policy, with local law enforcement and county, in particular counties, for example, to try to generate that. In California, it is less the case because of existing California law, but across the country, that has been a significant component of it. And then finally, there's been an extraordinary expansion of programs under 287G. 287G is a power that's provided under the Immigration Nationality Act that allows ICE to delegate certain authorities to local law enforcement in different criteria. There's 3 different models. We can get into those if you like. But for now, the one thing I'll point to is that there's been a significant increase of hundreds of now counties and local law enforcement that have been willing and wanting to cooperate with ICE specifically to try to transfer information or have detainers to hold migrants so that ICE can potentially come to do enforcement in those places. What does this mean then for, in general, immigrants in California? Well, what we've seen so far is that the largest number of undocumented immigrants and their children across the country live in California. Out of the 13.7 million undocumented immigrants that we have estimated at MPI, about 3 million of them live in the state of California. And actually, about 1 million live just alone in Los Angeles County. If you then think about the number, not just of immigrants who are undocumented, but their children, we've identified that there's about 6.3 million children in the United States who have at least one undocumented parent. And if you just narrow down to those children, we know there's 5.3 million US citizen children that have at least one undocumented parent. For those children specifically, being separated from their families could have a devastating impact, detrimentally impact as well, not just on their current local conditions or household, their economics, but their long-term development. And I think that here means and places a lot of specificity in how response in California could look like if there were increases in deportations in the state. So again, California is a top state that has the largest population of undocumented immigrants, and it is also the state with the most children who have at least one undocumented parent. Second, and I just made an example of here in Fresno, but in our website, we actually have a large number of counties within California that you can look up. We have a profile of undocumented immigrants, and within those, you can try to look at the counties that we have across California. I selected Fresno here to try to give you one example of that. Within Fresno, there's about 70,000 undocumented immigrants per calculations. The vast majority of them are Mexican, about 81%, but clearly they're migrants from other places, including some from India that we have found in our estimates. Most importantly, perhaps for the issues of enforcement, is that about 63% of immigrants in California who are undocumented, in Fresno, excuse me, that are undocumented, have spent more than 20 years in the United States. If you add up to 10%, if you look at just those that have had 10 years or more, you'll see that it's about 74% of people who have lived here for that long, at least 10 years, which means that they have families, likely they've been settled into their community, and therefore their separation has a significant effect, not just on them, but on their local communities. Additionally, I mentioned to you, I told you there was 5.3 million US citizen children that had one undocumented parent. In this case, for Fresno, we see that from the screen that you have on your screen, it shows that there's about 26,000 immigrants, undocumented immigrants in Fresno that have at least one US citizen child in their household. That's 26,000 immigrants who have at least one US citizen household. That's 39% of those who are within the 15 or older range, which is the people that we usually follow. And break up a marital status, you'll see that there's about 21% of those immigrants in Fresno County are married to a US citizen, 13% are married to a legal permanent resident, 14% are married to non-citizen, non-LPR, lawful other people with other lawful immigration statuses. And I think that's specifically important because it also has an effect on spouses, not just on children, if the spouses stay after the persons are detained and deported. And even if they're not deported, the impacts of being arrested and detained actually have a significant impact, according to large volumes of research, on children specifically if they know their parents have been taken away or are potentially going to be deported. So zooming out again, I think to understand the role of immigration enforcement, I want to divide them into arrests, detention, and deportations. When we look at arrests, and not everybody, by the way, who is arrested ends up being detained, and not everybody who is arrested ends up being detained and then later reported. But what we know so far from the latest data from the government, and I should say that this is most data that we haven't been able to verify, but according to the government, this is what they're doing, given that they have stopped publishing a lot of the data they previously reported is no longer being reported as frequently or as continuously. And in this case, we know that in terms of ICE arrests, there's about 221,000 that have happened since the beginning of the Trump administration to about mid-October. That is 221,000. Of those 221,000, 34%, about 74,000 were immigrants with no criminal convictions or pending criminal charges. 68% of those 221,000 were immigrants from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador combined. And that is not necessarily a change that we've seen in the past. These four nationalities have, in fact, been the leading or combined have been the top group of immigrants that are being usually subject to enforcement. They're also the largest group of people in the United States without status, but it is continuing to show that where these people are likely to be most affected and the needs potentially, for example, English-speaking uh, resources and other assistance could be most helpful for them. In California, of the 221,000 arrests, 18,000 have been in California, about 8%. It is still, it's not an insignificant number, and I'll show you in a minute the statistics of how this has changed across time. But if you compare that to Texas, that's 50,000 arrests in Texas, and in Florida, about 21,000. So there's been significant changes across states. Even though California has had the largest, we were still seeing relatively smaller arrests than in other places. Some of this is due to collaboration between Texas and Florida local law enforcement that we do not have in California, but clearly there are other factors. Of the 18,000, 41 of the 18,000 people arrested in California by ICE, 41% were immigrants without criminal convictions or pending charges. That is compared to 18% in Texas and 23% in Florida. So what this tells us is that in California, even though there are lower numbers of people being arrested, a larger proportion of them who are arrested have no criminal conviction or pending charge. They're for many of them, for most of them, their only reason for being arrested is because they're here without status. So they're usually called as immigration violator. That's usually the term that the administration has. Aside from ICE, we have a black box information of arrest under Border Patrol. Increasingly, Border Patrol has taken more and more um, attention and visibly implementing operations across the US, but we do not have data about how many they're arresting, how many people they're arresting, or the composition that they're arresting. And so therefore we don't know that. But if you combine ICE and CBP, including Border Patrol, the administration just recently announced that they have already arrested 595,000 immigrants. That's about 1,800 immigrants per day through early December, from the beginning of January or from January 20th through the beginning of December. That's 595,000 arrests. This include immigrants, not just in the interior, but also immigrants at ports of entry and at airports, potentially in other places, but we just don't know the data since they have not released the segregated components of it. When we look at arrests in California, even though they're relatively lower to other states, you'll see that they began to increase from this graph in June of this year, corresponding with some of the enforcement that we saw in LA, but also in other places. And that I think tells us a significant point of comparison to if I didn't, but if I had gone farther back, you would see the numbers during the Biden administration for ICE arrests have still remained relatively steady. What this chart also shows us is that the green bar is proportionally increasing across months, meaning that every month, or at least through the summer, the largest share of people being arrested in California did not have a criminal conviction or a pending charge. Those that had a criminal conviction are in the blue bar, and those that have pending charge are in the red bar. This looks a little bit different than in other states like Texas, if I would have to compare it here, but it shows you that the change began in June, and that there's an increase in those people who are not who do not have criminal convictions. Now, moving on to detention. Again, not every person who's arrested is detained, but if we look at immigrants in detention, we see that the administration has increased to its bed capacity in ICE detention facilities to about 70,000. And about 67,000 people were in detention in November. We don't know yet December figures, but as of this November, there were 67,000 people on average held in ICE detention across the country. This is a slow but gradual increase each month. At the end of the Biden administration, there was about 42,000 beds that ICE had. So we've seen an increase of more than 20,000 since January. And it is slowly but surely increasing. And I think we need to be mindful of that, what that could look like in the future. Second point is that most immigrants in detention are transferred by ICE, not CBP. So people who are arrested by ICE are most likely to be the ones who are going to be in detention. From this data, and again, it's an incomplete picture, but we are seeing that Border Patrol and CBP in general have less arrests that lead to detention. It doesn't mean that they're not arrested or deported. It just means that they're not detained. Um, the length of time in detention varies by location. In immigrant cases, the average is 47 days as of November. So an immigrant spends 47 days usually in immigrant detention. And most of the time, those immigrants, once they're released, is they're released to be deported. This administration has made it significantly difficult for immigrants to seek bond hearings. And in fact, many of the people who are detained in immigration detention usually end up seeking to have bond to departure, to then return to their country because the conditions in the detention center uh, are inhumane in some cases, but also difficult, being farther from communities and things like that. Among the detention time, those who are detained, immigrants booked by ICE have lower detention stays. They're about 41 days, meaning that if ICE detains someone, they usually will likely be more quickly removed, maybe because they have a criminal conviction, maybe because they were being more targeted compared to other parts of enforcement. But if a person is booked or is arrested and then later booked by CBP, the rate of the time they spend in detention goes up to 82 days. If you look at immigrants booked by CBP, just CBP, that have no criminal convictions or pending charges, the rate of detention goes up to 101 days, which means that many of those people who we know the least about may be spending the most time in detention, either because they're fighting their case to stay in the United States or for other reasons that we are not aware of yet. For example, proceedings that are still ongoing or other capacity issues that they may be facing. If you look at this other graph, it shows you that what I mentioned earlier, that the majority of people who are being booked into immigration detention are coming from ICE. That's a red bar. And then the blue bar is CBP. That has changed over time. If you look at October of last year, you'll see that there was more people being booked into detention by CBP. And now the large majority of people being detained and booked into custody are coming from ICE, corresponding to the first, among the first sets of slides that I showed you, where ICE arrests are increasing significantly. Now, if we look at how many of them have convictions, pending charges, or just are charged with being immigrant violators, you'll see that the share of those people who have no criminal conviction or pending charge has increased slowly across the months. If you look at October 2024, it was 6% of people under President Biden, under the administration of President Biden, that had a immigrant violation charge. If you look at October 2025, that went up by 30 to 37% under President Trump. So we went from 6 to 37%. If you then compare October 2024, the blue bar for conviction for migrants who had convictions or criminal convictions, it went from 65% in October 2024 to 32% in October 2025. What does this tell you? It tells us that more people are being subject to arrest and then detention, likely because of collateral arrests, meaning that more people are being asked about their status, and more of them are ending up in detention as compared to before if they have no prior criminal conviction in this case. So again, that trend is pretty steady there. We're now 40% of people in November that were detained had no criminal conviction or pending charge. The final step here is deportations. Not everybody that's detained is deported, though most people who are detained are deported. And the administration announced yesterday, actually, that 605,000 total deportations have been conducted by DHS as of yesterday. 605,000 deportations. Still, 605,000, while it's a big number, it is still lower than the 685,000 that were conducted under the last year of President Biden. So there's an increase in arrests, there's an increase in detention, but there's not yet an increase in deportations. And part of that reason is because in the past, the Biden administration relied primarily on deportations from the border, not from the interior, which tend to be longer lasting, higher resource capacity, and obviously, in many cases, with migrants who do have legal representation, a longer process time. The administration did say that they were hoping to have an objective of 1 million deportations per year. Clearly, that is still not within the reach of the Trump administration so far, but we do know that those could increase potentially here in a minute, as I'll show you. And it means that about 1,200 people were being deported per day since around June when it became steady. In the past, the numbers were significantly lower, but since June, it's been around 1,200 people per day are being deported to different countries, primarily to Mexico, Mexico and Central America. Additionally, now under the administration, we have an estimated number of 35,000 people who have left the country on their own. The administration calls these self-deportations. It's unclear exactly how many of them are using the CDP home application the administration has, but it is part of that. And the reports that we've seen suggest that about half of these 35,000 return with DHL assistance, for example, providing flight assistance for flight tickets or participating with DHS to provide a passport or a travel document to the country of origin. Though it has not been yet confirmed, we don't have as much specific data on this yet. When we look at Mexico, Mexico being the biggest destination or the biggest origin of undocumented immigrants, but also the biggest destination of deportees, we see that according to Mexican data, because the U.S. hasn't released this data yet, there were about 101,000 people deported through September 24th by the Trump administration to Mexico. That's 101,000. It is still a significant number, but it's lower than the annual average that we've seen either under President Biden or on previous times under President Obama, for example. Usually, since about 2020, we've seen about 200,000 Mexicans being deported to Mexico from the United States. The fact that we had 101,000 suggests that even deportations to Mexico this year will be lower than they were last year. And if you look at previous administrations, the administrations of President Bill Clinton and President Barack Obama had actually higher deportations that we saw under President George Bush and President Trump. So to finish up here, and before we go into questions, so after I've showed you this, what does that mean for the implications of deportations? There's at least three different focus of what those impacts could be. One, and perhaps the most direct one, is being separated from people, undocumented immigrants being separated from their families. I mentioned to you before, there was 5.3 million US citizen children, and for these children, having a parent be deported could be a significant detrimental effect for their development. There's a 4.2 million that I told you, immigrants who are married to a US citizen, undocumented immigrants who are married to a US citizen or an LPR, and for them too, separating from their family could be significantly affecting their psychosocial health. We'll talk about that in a minute. The administration of President Trump has suggested that many of these people could return or to go with their family members. At least from the latest research we have, most people do not go with their family members to the country they're being deported to. But for Mexicans, particularly, it could mean that there are a significant number of Mexican parents who are returning with their children, US citizen children, to live in Mexico. And that could be a whole nother conversation that we could think about, especially because of the bilateral border areas between Mexico and the US and San Diego, Tijuana area, for example. But a second component here is health and well-being. We've seen volumes of research document that deportations or the fear of deportations mean stress, depression, anxiety, behavioral, and other emotional issues for people who are in these households, even if they're not the ones being deported. There's also chilling effects on family access supports, people who may be eligible to receive benefits or supports from the federal government or state governments for that matter, but who fear that by doing so, they may be subject to deportation or that their family members then may be later subject to deportation, often forego accessing resources, most importantly, impacting usually US citizen children who need different supports to be able to have a proper nutrition or, for example, attend school. In addition to those children that do go to school, we've seen large volumes of research that have pointed that fear of deportation of someone in their household has negative effects on their academic attainment. Not only that people do not show up to school, which is usually among some of the key factors, but also that those who do show up to school are distracted, cannot concentrate, or therefore are otherwise unable to meet the academic demands that many of these, especially in high school, students face. The final aspect of this is economic. and this is probably the one that we know the least about. It's clear that there are direct impacts in industries where that rely on significant employment of undocumented immigrants. Agriculture is perhaps the most important one, but not the only one. The service industry, hotels, and others are also affected. But we don't yet know exactly with certainty exactly what has been or can be the financial impact for these industries and the economy. There are other factors. There's tariffs. There are changes in the broader economy that make it difficult to distill exactly what has been yet the effect of deportations or fear of deportations. But we know that multiple places and likely in the valley, in the Fresno Valley, this could be a significant impact. And then the last economic impact that we've looked at is that it could actually have a counterproductive effect over the long term if deportations increase, because for many countries, immigrant remittances are a significant focus of migrants' locally development in these countries. Guatemala, for example, about 20% of Guatemala's GDP is represented by remittances. Honduras and El Salvador have relatively smaller rates, but they continue to be significant and usually more than foreign direct investment. In Mexico, it's lower, but it's really could mean that in the future, if deportations were to reach massive quote unquote levels, that those countries may actually be facing more economic instability and could actually trigger more irregular migration to the United States for those reasons. I'm going to stop there you have the information here. We can put it in the chat if you want. I'm going to stop here so we can have some time for questions. And I look forward to hearing what you all are seeing in your communities, but also what you all think research could be helpful for. So Jesus, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ariel. And colleagues, Ariel has presented us a lot of very valuable information and insights in this analysis. We invite you to engage in a dialogue with him. Any questions, comments that you would like to make, please raise your hand, unmute yourself, and we will let you in to comment or to raise a question that you might have for Ariel. So please feel free to raise your hand. Or use the chat box if you like to write the question instead. While colleagues think about their questions or comments, I have several questions that have come up based on your presentation. One of them, Ariel, I don't know if you have right off the top of your head any specific information data on how the migration flows of undocumented immigrants across the border have been influenced in this current year by the Trump administration's policies. They emphasize that border crossings have come down to historically low levels. What's your estimate about what that flow looks like and what actually influenced the reduction in those flows?
Yeah, look, the administration in this case is right. They have seen a significant decrease in irregular arrivals at the U.S.-Mexico border. I should note that those decreases in arrivals had happened beginning last year under President Biden, but sped up once at the start of President Trump's administration. We see that on average, about 11,000 people show up every month to the U.S.-Mexico border. That is a significant change from levels or months in the past where there were hundreds of thousands of people per month that have been focused or coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. But again, I think it's not just due to the policies of the current Trump administration, but policies more broadly about essentially the end of asylum at the border under the Biden administration that's continued to the Trump administration. So when people do not have access to asylum at the border, which has been going through the courts, more or less people are willing to come to the border and try to enter the country. But also, we should note that enforcement by Mexico and Guatemala has skyrocketed over the last couple of years. So it's not just that the U.S. is seeing less migrants, but that more migrants are being stopped and apprehended by Guatemala and Mexico from usually pressure from the United States. So even though we're seeing less people come at the U.S. Mexico border, I think we need to be careful to not think that there's still not migration moving. In fact, we've seen that the number of asylum requests in Mexico are about the same as they were last year. We are seeing less people come to this Mexico border. It could be because migrants are waiting to see what the courts will say and the courts in the United States will say about different issues that are currently under litigation, or it could be that they're actually seeking to stay in Mexico as an alternative. We don't know yet. I think by next year we'll know more about that. And then finally, from even though there are lower numbers of people coming, again, I mentioned about 11,000 people per month, and it is historic. You would have to go back to around 2012 to see similar levels of what we're seeing now. But even beforehand, the levels of just in general enforcement is going to the 1970s. If you look at those people who are coming, they're primarily Mexican single adults, and that still shows that for whatever reasons, Mexican adults are still coming to the United States, even in smaller numbers, are still willing to make or forced to make this type of irregular crossings.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Alaina Osegueda. Has there been any research on why Republican administrations have had higher deportation rates?
Well, actually, the graph that I showed you would say the opposite, that Democratic administrations have had more deportations than Republican administrations in the past. But if we do look at the changes, and that's why I think this administration is potentially going to be the outlier, is that we are seeing potentially increasing deportations next year. And I didn't mention it directly in my remarks earlier, but there is the fact that the Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill law means that there is now about $75 billion dollars that are destined to go to immigration enforcement over the next 4 years and could in fact create additional deportations. I think we have to balance that. The administration hasn't yet reached massive deportations, but it doesn't mean that they will not do it next year. And I think, in fact, more even beyond the scale, the optics, the visibility, the tactics that the administration is using are different than even under its first term in office.
Yeah, Alaina did correct her comment. Based on this question as well and your comments, one thing that I'd like to ask about, based on reflection also on what has happened historically, before when NAFTA was being discussed way back in the early 1990s, and again, I'm an old guy, so I remember that discussion that was taking place way back then. Some of the most important researchers who were experts in U.S.-Mexico relations and Mexican migration to the U.S., some of them were pointing out that an immediate impact of the implementation of NAFTA could cause up to 10 million Mexicans from being displaced from the rural areas, but also from Mexican industries that could not compete with the U.S. And they argued way back then, like Clark Reynolds, among others, that some of those 10 million Mexicans who were being displaced would end up deciding to come to the U.S. So that explained also why there was a migration increase from Mexico to the U.S. in the aftermath of NAFTA. What you pointed out in your slide in terms of the number of people that were being deported, we saw in that slide that the deportations under the Clinton administration were also the highest, if I'm not mistaken. So, this goes back to Alaina's question, but also mine. What has taken place in terms of the approach the Democratic administrations, including Clinton, including Obama, including Biden, that they have also failed to come up with a solution to develop a comprehensive immigration reform that would in fact consider, options so that people could migrate to the U.S. from Mexico and elsewhere with the benefit of a visa. Immigration was really not incorporated into NAFTA. It hasn't been incorporated into the current agreement either. Why has that also been the case with Democratic administrations from your perspective?
That's a tough question. There's a lot there that we can unpack. Jesus, let me try to throw a few answers out there, and we'll see which one sticks. The first one is that there's actually the research on the repercussions of NAFTA on migration from Mexico is actually somewhat mixed. Yes, it did lead to, in the beginning, increase in migration, but we actually began to saw that at the end, toward the end, or I guess toward the beginning of the 2000s and the end of the early 2000s, Mexican migration began to decrease as education levels, fertility rates, economic or poverty rates also began to fall in Mexico. So there has been, and we should acknowledge, Mexico in the 2000s actually grew in some of these aspects and made the middle class of Mexico to be more relatively stable. But the people that kept migrating were those migrants that were left out from those benefits that the NAFTA and other agreements were supposed to have. The second point is, what does it mean when what about democratic administrations? Oftentimes, either by choice or pressure across Congress, the democratic approach has been to try to, in some ways, show force of deportation and to try to reach compromises with Republicans to show that they are doing more on removals, for example. That oftentimes has backfired. It backfired during President Obama's term, when then the discussions on their comprehensive immigration reform were happening, and Republicans were not able or willing to compromise with Democrats at that time. But we should also note that even when Democrats have had Congress, the White House in the control, Democrats haven't been able to deliver any significant reforms on immigration when there was complete control, especially under the Obama administration. What I think sets apart Democrats and Republicans on these issues beyond the particular things of what you do at the border or how do you help people is trying to understand the dynamics of what would happen after something passes. I think sometimes the fears among Congress of passing any immigration reform is that they so-called there will be sort of a magnet effect of people. If you do something and show that you can legalize or help people here, more people will come. Research has not shown that's the case, at least not traditionally or in a way that's reliable. And that's what happened with DACA and then potentially what happened with DAPA in those conversations where they say that if we do something positive to help migrants, many more of them will likely come. And we haven't seen that be the case yet. And the final comment that I'll say on this issue of terms of Democrats and Republicans, I think increasingly the conversation, especially after 9/11, has been on both sides of the aisle about security issues. We've seen recently with the focus of the tragedy that happened in DC, where the National Guard person was killed by an Afghan refugee, has triggered, in some ways, overemphasizing security and vetting processes that, in fact, are relatively secure and included, especially for this one person who was part of the CIA or worked with the CIA on issues of this notion. So I think it's been a conversation that's for a long time has been about securing national security and politics, less about migrants. But I do agree that more needs to be done to try to understand how do you help people who are here without documentation or without legal permanent temporary status. What would that look like? And I think there are some bills in Congress. We can get into that if you like, but the likelihood that this will pass is unfortunately relatively low.
Thank you. Sara Campos, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. I think I did. I hope you can hear me. Excuse me. I'm just curious, Ariel, you said that Mexican single adults are still coming in,
Yes,
relatively large numbers. I'm wondering what are some of the reasons, given that Mexico has fairly middle class, increased its numbers of middle class people. And I'm wondering if these cases or these people that are coming, are they more serious cases, asylum cases, fleeing cartels, or what do you know about that population?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data to get to the root of your question. But what I can tell you is that the part of the reason, not maybe all of it, but part of the reason why Mexican single adults are still coming to the United States irregularly is because of demand in the economy of the United States. Usually, and this has been proven in research that not just us, but other people have looked at, is when the U.S. economy does well, we usually see an increase in irregular migration from Mexico to the U.S., regardless of how the economy is happening in Mexico. If the situation in the United States is better, migrants usually come. And despite what we've heard across national debates on the issues of what immigrants do or do not do to help the economy, in general, immigrants are a net positive for the type of economic growth that we've seen. And so even in periods where there's high inflation or recession, migrants usually are the part of the backbone of that growth that is happening. And I think that's what we're seeing. Mexicans who are who are maybe more willing to come to the United States regularly because they know that if they'll be deported more closer to home. That could potentially change. We did see a Mexican person who was a couple of months ago deported to Africa. It could be a change in consequence, but for now, the calculus of when people come, I think, is different. The other point that I think, and you're right, that in general, and like you said, and what I suggested earlier, generally the economic conditions in Mexico had been relatively improving over the last couple of decades, but security has ebbed and flowed. And in fact, security issues in Mexico over the last year have began to increase again compared to prior years. Not everywhere, let me make sure that's clear. Not everywhere in Mexico is unsafe, but we're beginning to see places in Michoacan, in even Chiapas, that didn't see as many issues of violence that now are, and therefore are increasingly subject potentially to coming to the United States for non-economic reasons and in need of protection. We just don't have the data to be conclusive on that.
Can I ask another question, Ariel? And that is with respect to the people that either are returned or return or never make it to the U.S. I'm just wondering about bottlenecks or like enclaves of migrants throughout that corridor that came from, as far south as Venezuela, Ecuador, all the way up. Just wondering, are people stranded in these locations? What do you know about them?
Well, we know I didn't have the slides for this, but what we know is that there's been an increasing number of migrants that across recent years, especially since 2021, were coming from farther away. The people at the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama certainly were. Some of them were staying in Panama, some of them were staying in Costa Rica. Costa Rica, by the way, is a relatively rich country in Central America, has some job opportunities, but migrants, when they know that they can potentially make more money or are perceived to be safer in the United States, choose to continue to go northbound. People are staying in Mexico. They had staying in Mexico for about a decade. We're seeing, for example, Haitians who stayed in Chiapas, Haitians who stayed in Tijuana, and who have, in general, integrated in ways to their communities that have been unexpected, but also have contributed to the growth in those places as well. Cubans also stayed in some places in Ciudad Juarez and across the larger sectors, and we did see some Asian immigrants who were going through Mexico that actually stayed in the more urban hubs of the country, but it usually tends to be smaller numbers. The difficulty about trying to pinpoint the answer to your question is that people, even once people are staying in places, it doesn't mean they'll be there for forever. And we tend to see that sort of slow growth, that when people, if anti-immigrant sentiment increases in places, for example, Venezuelans who were initially in Ecuador and Chile, who then were being either forced to leave because of changing politics or because of the economic conditions began to change, then make their way to another place. And I think that's part essentially of what migration is. People move when they feel that they have better conditions somewhere else and access to protection.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Matt, you also had raised your hand. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Ariel, great work as always. Thank you so much for all the information. And I'm kind of unsure if you covered this, so my apologies if you did. Do we know where most of the ICE detentions, apprehensions, and arrests of undocumented immigrants conducted in the interior are happening? Like, are they on the street versus at workplaces or courts or check-ins? And then if we do know that, is that differentiated by chance by region or city at all?
Good question, Matt. We have some data about this, but I don't think you'll really get to your question. What we know is that Texas and Florida have the most immigration arrests, and that most of those arrests in those two states either happen in county jails or prison systems that are sending people to ICE, or for traffic violations and patrols. And that's been a significant issue, especially in Texas, where now the highway patrol is able to detain and ask certain, in some cases, people's immigration status. That's different than in California, where because of the lack of, or the limited, I should say, because California does cooperate with ICE in many cases, because of the limited cooperation by California with ICE, more people are actually arrested at large. And we had some early data from this at the end of the Biden administration, but I can't guarantee that is the same or it continued into the Trump administration. That is something that we saw started last year and the years before. We cannot confirm the case. In terms of immigration arrests in courts, I think that's a significantly new development of the Trump administration, and one that actually counters the interest of the immigration system in some regards. People who do want to go through the process to find out if they can have access to asylum or be able to stay in the country under other benefits are now questioning whether by trying to do things quote unquote the right way, they may actually be going to the process where they can actually be removed if an ICE attorney files to dismiss a case and then is arrested. That migrant is arrested outside the courts. It's mostly happened in New York City. It's also happened in a couple other places, but it's mostly been in New York City, as far as I'm aware.
Thanks. I'm also curious if we have any type of disaggregated data about the status of immigrants who have been arrested, right? I think you gave the number before of the 67,000 folks who are currently detained, but do we know, because we're seeing, right, I mean, just even on just social media pieces, some news outlets, in terms of folks with statuses that are not undocumented who are being arrested. Do we know any disaggregation of that, of documented, those with DACA, asylees, et cetera?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, we don't have data on ICE arrests or any other arrest by the administration by status. We don't know. We have seen an increase of the more temporary liminal statuses, not just the DACAs, but also and TPS people with TPS or DACA, but also people with CHNV. This is the program for Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, who now, and in some cases Ukrainians, who've now also lost access to TPS or other protection.
Yeah. All right. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. We have three other questions. Oscar Hinojosa asked, given that states like Texas, California, and Florida account for large portions of ICE detention populations, what % of enforcement and detention activity occurs in other states, and what might explain those differences?
Partially, the answer to the question is the size of the size of the population that's documented in the state, right? So there has been an increase in cases of arrest in Idaho, for example. The population there, relatively speaking, is smaller. And I want to distinguish the fact that despite that California is the state with the largest undocumented population, it is the third largest state of immigration enforcement. It is not number one or number two. And that tells you that local law enforcement cooperation and state policies do make an increase in arrest and enforcement. So it is to do that. There are other states, I didn't include them. If you want, if you go to Google and type in immigration arrest data deportation project, which I recommend you all check out, there are tools that you can yourself click through and show where most migrants are being arrested or impacted by immigration enforcement. There are some caveats about the data. This comes from FOIA requests. It's not directly by the administration, and so there are some changes you need to be aware about. But generally, you'll see there's a map tool there are many map tools, but one of them that shows you across the board where things are happening. If you were to look across the board, New York, Illinois, Arizona, but also places like Louisiana, Georgia specifically, that also have significant components of immigration enforcement.
Thank you, Ariel. Hilda Zarate, would you like to please unmute yourself? It's a long question, so let me see, Hilda.
Okay. Yeah,
Thank
can
you.
you hear me? I couldn't find where to unmute myself. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Ariel. I want to ask you from the public health perspective, Ariel, if large-scale deportations continue for the next 3 years, what do you think the effects in the healthcare system, particularly, well, we have, significant issues with trust, access, insurance coverage, and emergency utilization? Do you think what the effects would be, and which parts of the system do you think will be the most vulnerable for long-term disruption? That's a big question.
It is. Look, let me reframe it a little bit. I hope I get to answer what you suggested, but let me try to reframe it into what I think has been where we at NPR are going to be looking for in research in the next couple of years, and that's mixed status families. If we can just for one moment put aside everything that I said about just the larger undocumented population, if we look at mixed status families, and that is families that have at least one undocumented person or a mix of statuses, somebody who has TPS and somebody who has DACA, or somebody who has who's a U.S. citizen and somebody who is just who has a temporary visa, those are likely going to be the places that are the most sensitive to changes in enforcement. As you know, there's a significant amount of barriers for undocumented immigrants to actually receive resources, except for some provided by states like California. Otherwise, the limitation across the US, the undocumented immigrants have very limited access to different services in the healthcare system as well. And in fact, the Trump administration has rolled back some of that access that some states were trying to do to work, for example, with DACA beneficiaries to seek private insurance opportunities. I think the most focus or the place where there may be the most impacts is going to be those for US citizen children and for pregnant mothers who have access to some services or need certain assistance. Now, it's not the first time we saw, and in fact, not just enforcement, but this idea that there was the public charge rule that was trying to suggest that even if you are here with status, if you seek services or benefits, that might be counted against you later in the future if you try to adjust your status. That is a significant chilling effect for people, even who do have status in the country, because they feel that if they do any of the things that they are eligible for, that those may be then later counted against them. So I think it'll likely come to me, looking at this would be children, access for children from pediatrician, access, as well as to early and late development that is likely to be the most affected. But I don't think it's going to be affected in most cases. Perhaps the one silver lining of recent studies and surveys that you may be aware of that just came out this last couple of months suggests that even though people overall are more afraid of reaching out to their hospitals or seeking care, they are still going to, or at least report that they are still willing to go to local clinics and smaller places they trust. And I think then the opportunity / the burden of that will be how do states work with local clinics that migrants trust to provide services that they need. That is sort of where I would see the research, at least from my perspective, going.
Thank you, Ariel. Thanks.
And we have one last question, Ariel, and we've come up to our time limit for today. But we have a question, if we could take a couple of minutes to answer it. It says, you mentioned that there has been less cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE in California than in states like Texas and Florida, due to California laws that limit those local police departments and sheriffs from granting detainer requests. My understanding is that there are exceptions to that California law, and some local law enforcement do cooperate with federal immigration agencies more than others in California. Have you looked at any data that shows whether that has increased or decreased under Trump 2.0?
Right. So I should start by a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in the California Values Act, but that is the one law that has restrictions on in which instances local law enforcement is able to participate or cooperate with ICE. I want to be very clear. Even in California, there are some data sharing of people who are convicted and are in the state prison system, and that has continued to be shared with ICE. But for traffic violations or for other lower level crimes, there's a significant process in which that could be the data for those processes that could be shared, or at least a protocol that has to be followed for those to be shared. In general, again, there's likely exceptions that I'm not aware about. You're right to point out that there are jurisdictions across the state that are trying to work with the federal government, or at least claim that by not working with the federal government, they may be then targeted by the federal government for not cooperating. Some in Northern California, but also some in Southern California. And I think that is going to be a continuing evolution of what unlikely potentially could reach litigation standards of what states can actually do to limit or not local jurisdictions from participating in federal enforcement, especially when the federal government is playing, it's pressuring more local jurisdictions to comply, and if not, that they will lose funding for significant and required needs. The final aspect that I'll say about this is perhaps the one area, even in California, where there is opportunities, even if limited, to collaborate with ICE is on certain task forces. Gang task forces and others do have more broader opportunities to collaborate or share data with immigration officials if they think that otherwise those would not lead or help in the investigations that they're conducting. So let's be clear about that too. And for a state that has a long coast border, most of California is within the 100-mile jurisdiction of the Border Patrol. And in the interior, ICE field offices expand multiple parts of the state, but also other states. So for example, the San Francisco field office includes part of Nevada. The LA office includes also some parts of, I think is the part of also in Nevada. And then you have the San Diego office that includes the San Diego and maybe a little bit into Arizona. So there is differences even within field offices that they may be sharing across states, and therefore maybe also important to consider. But in general, California does have certain restrictions, especially more than other states. It is not the only state that does this, but I think we should be clear. Every state, in some degree, does collaborate with ICE enforcement.
Great. Thank you very much, Ariel, and colleagues from the Central Valley and other parts. Thank you very much for joining us in this very informative event. The analysis that you have presented and all the data that you've shared, Ariel, I think helps us better understand the current situation. So I'm very grateful for agreeing to do this with us. And to everyone else, thank you for joining us. If Ariel is okay with it, we can share the PowerPoint presentation via PDF, and we hope to also upload the recording to civic.org website. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Ariel.
Thank you all. Take care.